Good morning, good evening to everybody. We're here in a new dialogue of systemic reflections, and this time with Walden Bello. Walden Bello, a very well-known sociologist from the Philippines, author of many books, recently the book Counter-Revolution, The Global Rise of the Far Right. Walden was the executive director of Focus on the Global South, a think tank in Southeast Asia. And now he's joining us for this conversation from Bangkok, Thailand. And here I am again with you, Pablo Solon from Bolivia. Walden Bello, it's a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you very much, Pablo, for inviting me onto your show.
Well, we're here to speak about what is happening with the neoliberal globalization. Is it going to die? Is it dead already? And the second most important thing, what are our alternatives? What are the alternatives from the side of the people? And in order to start this conversation, we're going to first hear a small statement of Martin Kor. Martin Kor was born in 1951 in Malaysia. He was the director of Third World Network created in 1984. And in 2008, he became director of the South Center, an intergovernmental organization that has developing countries as members. Martin was very active in different multilateral issues linked to trade, climate, and finance. Martin passed away 1 week ago, and we want to start this dialogue remembering something he said in an interview with Tom Cruise just 7 months ago.
I think the present crisis that we now face, we have the crisis of the environment, especially climate change. We have the crisis of financial turbulence due to the way in which financial liberalization and financialization of the economy has gone ahead so fast. And I think that was quite predictable for those who had been criticizing, financial globalization. And then finally, we have the crisis of the trading system, that had looked so impenetrable. Impenetrable meaning that, it was quite difficult to shake it. And now, in just a few years or months, the whole foundation seems to be on the verge of crumbling. And finally, we are about to have this crisis of the real economy, maybe a global recession, and this will probably magnify the inequalities and contradictions that hyper-globalization has brought about, and give more impetus to extremism, particularly the kind of unhealthy populism that you just go for yourself and look after your own interests, and then you don't cooperate with others. So I think this is the stage we are now in. We have entered into this crisis already. It's not the beginning stage, it's already in the first half, but the second half of it may be terrible.
So, what do you say, Walden? I think it's a very interesting introduction done by Martin about what we are discussing. The crisis already started. He says that we are not at the beginning, we're almost at the middle, and what is coming is very terrible. So the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I think it was good to see Martin. I hadn't seen him for a long, long time. And what he said was, of course, something that was very prescient, And what I just like to say is that about almost 15 years ago, he had written in a book, an edited book called Alternatives to Globalization, that in about 20 years, the system would blow up. And that is why you had to, on the one hand, for the short term, you had to protect the interests of developing countries through fighting off neoliberal reforms, which he was doing in trade and climate issues, meaning he was as head of the Third World Network and later the South Center, he was a central figure in terms of opposing neoliberal measures that were being imposed on developing countries. And to some extent, he was successful in that. But he also said, that, we have to prepare for a time after the crisis when there will be opportunities to recreate the world on what he thought was Gandhian lines, mainly smaller units, where people interact to one another, either at the community level, at the national level, or the regional level, but certainly away from the sort of globalized economy. So that was, something that he wrote about 15 to 20 years ago. And so right here, he is saying that the crisis is now upon us. So I think that Martin saw the structural flaws, or the structural fissures of the globalized capitalist system, that although there seemed to be, it had escaped going into collapse after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, although it went into deep stagnation. But he saw that the kind of solutions that you had, the kind of situation that was created in that emerged from that was a very weak kind of system, that it was just a matter of time before the foundations collapse. And I think he had a very good sense of that. And I don't think he quite foresaw the coronavirus, the COVID-19. I don't think he thought that it would be a virus that would come. Who knows? He might have, but I don't think he foresaw it that way. But I think the important thing is he was saying that the structures are already quite weak. They're rotten, okay? And that something could happen in which that whole structure begins to come down. And I think that was a very important message that Martin had, which a number of us shared, especially after the 2008-2009 crisis. We said, that this is a very, very bad financial crisis, which is also hitting and creating havoc in the real economy. And we said that, this was a time that we should begin to think about alternative ways of reorganizing the way our economic life. But once the peak of the crisis passed, it all went back to business as usual. The kind of solutions that we, including you, Pablo, and others, the kind of systemic alternatives that you called it, the kind of alternative arrangements that would not be a capitalist arrangements, those sort of were brushed aside, okay, by the same powers that be that had created, the global financial crisis. Okay, so that was an opportunity that was lost, and I think the opportunity that was lost there was is something that was partly because of the weakness of the broad left, the broad progressive left. If when the 2008, 2009 economic crisis hit, if only we had a stronger progressive movement throughout the world, the outcome for that might have been different, and we would not have this kind of situation that we have right now. Now, the big problem is that many of the broad left governments, or you might say broad liberal governments in Europe and the United States in particular, had been implicated in neoliberal reforms, as they call it. For instance, the Social Democrats in continental Europe, the Labour Party in Britain, the Democrats in the United States, they were the ones who had, pushed for neoliberal reforms that, were destructive of the income of workers, resulted in incomes that were stagnant, okay, and prioritized the business and prioritized the interests of corporations, and neglected, for instance, in throughout the United States, the people who got indebted because they lost their homes, the big housing crisis in the United States. And I guess I'm pointing that out to say that that the ability to wrestle with the crisis and the ability to make the crisis an opportunity to push for major fundamental changes could not be taken, the opportunity to do that, because many of these forces, many of these broad left movements and political parties had been part of the problem in the first place. Okay, so this was then one of the really major problems that made progressives or the left unable to take that opportunity to change the foundations of the system. Moreover, what we saw was that in many countries, because the Social Democrats and the Democratic Party in the United States, and their, for instance, in the United States, Bill Clinton, and later under Obama, were seen as not really promoting the interests of workers, but instead were promoting the interests of big capital. Many of their working class base began to feel, oh my God, where are we? Who's representing us now? And so, because there was a representational crisis, and many of these people began to move to other parties, and you know, these were opportunistic, extreme right-wing parties that basically had a message that, look, your old parties that you used to vote for, you know, are not taking care of you. They're part of the problem, okay? You know, and, you know, so we're here and we're going to promote your interests. And they said, you know, that, okay, the big problem really is, you know, that, you know, you have all of these migrants coming in uh, into our shores, and the liberals and the social democrats, and even the center right, were complicit with the migrants that were coming in and taking away your jobs, which had no basis in fact at all. And moreover, said that, you know, so many of these migrants, and many of them are now here, don't belong to our culture, you know, that they don't belong to our religion, and the economy must really only be for those who have been here, you know, traditionally from the very beginning. In other words, the white ethnic stocks, okay? You know, and that's what the economy is for. And that was the kind of message that they got. And so this was, that was the way that they were able to recruit so many of these disillusioned people who felt that their traditional political parties had abandoned them. And some of these parties that they then, extreme right-wing parties, you know, came to power in certain countries, like for instance in Hungary, under Viktor Orban. And then we had a situation whereby Trump was elected in the United States mainly because workers who used to vote for the Democratic Party in the Midwest either abandoned, did not, went to the Republicans, or they did not vote at all, which enabled Trump to win according to the rules of the American political system. Or they did not even need to go into government, but they just had to get a sizable part of the vote and be in parliament. Just by that, the extreme right was able to push politics to the right. And it wasn't only in developing in Europe and the United States. It was also in many other countries throughout the world. You had Bolsonaro appeal to the same thing in Brazil. You know, say, you know, bringing together, you know, this appeal saying that, oh, you know, it's the socialists or the Workers' Party people, you know, have messed it up and they're corrupt and that sort of thing. Duterte said it was you know, it was drug addicts that were the problem, and he proceeded to say, and he won the 2016 elections in the Philippines, saying that the problem is crime. And Modi in India, you know, also appealed, saying that, hey, you know, the problems are the Muslims, and we have to create a Hindu state. So the political currents, the rise of authoritarianism really stemmed from the crisis of the neoliberal capitalist system, the way that it was no longer fulfilling human needs, and the way that the left, or a significant part of the left, was seen as part of the problem, that it was complicit with this whole neoliberal system. So basically, this was the sort of very, very dangerous formula that was coming together. And I think Martin, as we heard him, he was referring to that the political consequences of the rise of the right in that last interview that we saw. So for me, that was one dimension of it. But the bigger dimension of it, to me, is something that I referred to earlier, is, you know, that, you know, after the peak of the crisis, we had a new phase of globalization. And this is something that I wrote about. And this new phase of globalization was what we would call connectivity. Okay, and here the idea that its proponents were saying is that, hey, we have digital connectivity, but connectivity is also important in terms of the economy. And above all, we mean connectivity in terms of transportation. We need air connectivity because that is really the source of successful globalization. Uh, and we also need, more projects coming together across great distances. And here, what happened is that even as the United States under Trump went into a more economic nationalist kind of perspective, and Trump was leading this idea that America first, it was China under Xi Jinping that came up with, say, hey, globalization is good. The only problem is we need to fix things up a bit here. And so and China under Xi Jinping offered this idea of global connectivity through the Belt and Road Initiative, as they call it. Okay, and the whole idea was that you had these two routes that were taken, but was created in the early modern period between Asia and Europe and China. And again, those two routes, or the maritime and the land route of ancient times, the image of that was invoked to say we will now have a new connectivity linking Europe to Asia. And beyond that, however, it became bigger and bigger and bigger, so that by 2016, 2017, you no longer had just two routes, no longer just the Silk Route and the maritime route. You now had 6 or 7 throughout the world, including a polar Silk Route. And the Chinese government basically saying, hey, we are going to finance this to the tune of $1 trillion, and there will be a lot of countries brought together because this is the great connection. The BRI is the great connection, the Belt and Road Initiative. So, you had the situation, therefore, the connectivity as the new phase, one of which was global transportation connectivity, faster and faster and faster, faster cargo routes, faster air transportation, etc. Plus this massive project that would extend throughout the world in terms of connecting the world through rail lines, coal, energy projects, capital-intensive projects, all these big developmentalist type of projects that were supposed to be the future. And that's the kind of phase of globalization we had when the coronavirus struck in just a few months ago. So the irony of it is that, this so-called air connectivity, faster, greater, better transportation links throughout the world became the medium for the spread of the virus, okay, which was moving at internet speed. Okay, so the very thing that that connectivity had created as supposedly the more glorious phase of globalization also became the channels through which the virus spread very rapidly throughout the world. But there was even a bigger problem here, Pablo, because the BRI was such disregarded ecological considerations and that sort of thing. Okay, it was just supposed to be this big project that, you know, would go across the board and, you know, connect all these different countries with all of this land, rail, and other construction. And there was, in fact, a study that was done by, I believe, the World Wildlife Federation that said, you know, that this was going to be a major ecological disaster at various levels, deforestation and so many other problems that would be created by this situation, impact on climate change. But it also said very interestingly and in a very worrisome way that there were at least 800 invasive species that were not indigenous to the different ecologies that would cross over, okay, ecologically in those different countries where they were going to have these vast BRI projects. And it identified 800 amphibians, mammals, and others that would create, because they were not going to be in their natural habitat, they would create dislocations, okay? And many of those, by the way, were animals identified like the pangolin, okay, and civet cats that had already been identified in the past as carriers or hosts of viruses like the coronavirus, like MERS and the others. And so many of this wildlife, their lives or natural habitat would be damaged. And as we all know, it is through this, the viruses don't affect the functioning of the animals hosts that they have, okay? Because I guess genetically over thousands of years, they had developed immunity. But what the problem was when those viruses leaped from the animal hosts to human beings who have not developed immunity, then that is where the problem really begins. Now, we already had warnings of this with the Sars epidemic or pandemic back in the early 2000s, where again, there was a virus that leaped through certain mediums like civet cats to human beings. And then the MERS-CoV virus was the same thing. But the common thing is that they disrupted. They were created by problems, intrusion of economic projects, the destruction of forests, the invasion by human beings, communities of wildlife. And this created then the conditions for species leaping from one species to another. And I think this is what happened again in the what has been investigated as with respect to the coronavirus, starting off in Wuhan, in the wet markets of Wuhan. But you can just also imagine, that with the BRI having such a big ecological impact in so many of the world, so many of the countries that were going to be involved in it, that more and more of this kind of leaping from one species to another by viruses would have been among the impacts, aside from the ecological destabilization that would in fact be taking place over this period. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that connectivity the big catchword of the last several years, has created the conditions for this crisis. And now it does seem like people are basically saying, oh my God, look at what's happened here. Not only has the air connectivity been the channel for the rapid spread of the virus, and it does seem like it really was this massive air transportation that was speed, the air infrastructure that was created. But when China began to shut down because of fears of the virus, people began to realize that, hey, it's not just the problem of air connectivity, it's the problem that globalization has brought us because of all the industrial facilities that had moved from the north, that had moved from the United States, that had moved from different countries, Southeast Asia to China, because China became the so-called manufacturing of the world. And the reason they had moved there was because of cheap labor, because of the way that labor was exploited by corporations like Foxconn, for instance, which was the partner of Apple. Okay, and so given the low costs of wages, you had this situation whereby so much production facilities became concentrated in China, and deindustrialization took place in not only in the north, but countries like Mexico, Brazil, Southeast Asia. So many of traditional industrial facilities were moved to China because of the idea that, hey, go for the area where you have the least cost of labor. So now we began to see that when China shut down, then you had this big problem of supplies, okay, components, manufactured goods. There was going to be a fear that there would be delays, etc., etc. But even more tragic is that even basic manufacturing capacity for surgical masks, okay, for syringes, okay, for gloves, many of these countries had lost that, okay, and now you are basically seeing how in the United States, for instance, which is the image of the big modern country, health workers don't even have access to surgical gloves, surgical masks, and what more the general population. So, and all because of this idea, that, globalization means letting the market do its logic. It will create the best of all possible worlds, and it will create the most efficient relocation of production because it, industries will go where the costs are lowest. Sure, they all went to China. Of course, that's an exaggeration. And then when the crisis hit, countries began to realize, oh my God, we've lost our productive capacity. Okay, so basically, I think that really what the coronavirus COVID-19 has really exposed is that globalization, which ran into major crisis in 2008 to 2009, but recovered. Now this might be its deathbed. Okay, it has shown, that really not building up your economy to have a capacity for sustainability can in fact be the prescription for national disaster. And I think that so many, all of these economists that had basically said, oh, don't worry, let the market let the market do its logic. It will, allocate resources in the most efficient way. Okay, so that kind of ideology, the neoliberal ideology that was technocrats, Harvard Business School, academics, throughout the world, that bought into that, are must be seen as having been part and parcel of the creation of this crisis. So you now have the German minister saying, "Oh, we need to localize production. Oh, we need to relocalize this, etc., etc." But sure, relocalization is correct, but I don't think that they really know, what they are talking about. That um, they're really thinking just in the short term that, hey, we just need to put some industries here and there, or Trump thinks and the others think, oh, the Defense Production Act in the United States, we're going to put it into motion to push corporations to build, have their industrial facilities to build surgical masks and that sort of thing. So they're thinking about it in very short-term terms, non-strategic at all. But they don't see that the problem, really was this globalized division of labor, as you call it, that was created, and it's a mentality. Okay, so unless you get rid of that mentality that basically continues to hold the minds of academics and technocrats, etc., you're not going to be able to get out of this crisis that we're in, or the world is in right now. They feel that my sense is, that you will have all of these short-term measures. Okay, you will have the $2 trillion stimulus in the United States. Many other countries will do that, but this is like Band-Aid, to this. And their hope is that once the crisis is gone, once you've eliminated, that the virus goes, we're going back to normal. Okay, that is really what they're thinking at this point in time. And if that's what they're thinking, then I think it's up to the rest of us who've been, saying all along that the big problem has been, this neoliberalism, globalization, corporations. These are the sources of the problem that we have right now. It's really incumbent on us to push our alternatives out there and say that there's no going back to the past, because the past was the problem. Okay, and we really need to reorganize things in a way, that promotes the interests of human beings, that creates sustainable economies, that creates capacity. Okay, and that puts human interests ahead of the interests of profitability. And that's, I think, the fight that we are going to be engaged in now. And the way I look at this is that here is an opportunity. Unfortunately, it is true that crisis is the mother of opportunity. Okay, and so and I think Martin also had that sense, and many others. You have that sense that this is a time when we really ought to be putting alternatives forward. Of course, it's not going to be easy, and part of the problem is, even as we're engaged in this internet kind of exchange, we're also locked down. Okay, and the kind of proposals that we have, is one that involves people in close physical contact with one another, marching on the streets, creating a critical mass. And we'll just have to deal with that in this period of where we're physically isolated from one another. So it's a very tough time for organizing.
Well, thank you very much, Walden. I take one thing that you said. No, this crisis we could have avoided if we would have learned from the crisis of 2008. But progressive movements wasted that precious time of almost 10 years. And here we are in a much deeper crisis than what we had in 2008.
Right.
And what could we have done in order to avoid this crisis? And I think now, everybody speaks about flattening the curve. You have heard to flatten the curve so that the cases of coronavirus don't have a peak in just a short period of time, and they are spread. So you don't go beyond the capacity of the health system in your country. But there is another curve that we need to flatten. And it is the curve of productivity, of trade, of exploitation of natural resources, in order to not go beyond the capacity of the Earth system. Because if we continue, and this crisis is because we have went beyond this. We have destroyed ecosystems of animals. We have destroyed the ecosystems of living beings that, of course, now emerge in different ways, provoking this kind of viruses. And this will continue. We know it. We know that when the climate change gets worse, permafrost will be lost, and you will have thousands of new viruses coming out to the earth. And we know it. But we didn't flatten the curve. We didn't limit our activities to what was possible under this Earth system. And if we don't learn this time from this experience, if we don't come out saying, okay, what is the new economy and how this economy has to be embedded in nature, has to take account the limits of nature, its vital cycles, we're going to repeat the same mistake. And I take a second thing that also Martin says, this time the crisis, I think it's going to be worse because it's not only an economic crisis, it's the mix between an economic crisis, an environmental crisis. Now we're heading to a very social, deep crisis because hundreds and thousands, millions of workers are going to be fired, are going to be unemployed. Here in Bolivia, the amount of small companies that are saying we will have to close, there is no demand, we don't have resources to produce, and so on. So this means we will have millions and millions of people in worse conditions than what we had already before the coronavirus. So all of these crises are coming together. It is now a much more complicated situation. I call it's more a systemic crisis because it brings everything. It's a huge crisis, and it's not something, as you clearly said, it's not something that, okay, after 3 months, we're going to go back to normal. I don't think so. Different studies show that even the coronavirus crisis, it's going to take at least 1 year, 1.5 years, or maybe 2 years, only to get out of this. Because, yeah, the quarantine, maybe we will relax it in some weeks or months, But that will not be over. A new kind of measures have to be put in place because the situation will continue and we have to be very careful about it. But the crisis is going to be permanent, chronic. So I think we have come from a capitalism that had always cyclical crisis into a capitalism that now has a chronic crisis, lives in a crisis. And I was thinking, where are we in terms of globalization? So the idea that I think it was the director of the WTO, I don't know if you remember him, he said that his plan was to write a constitution for the world. And that was one of the main aims of the WTO. Well, that today is almost totally forgotten because countries are fighting one each other among another. There is very little solidarity, not only on the trade system, the European Union, what is happening with Germany and the Netherlands, and on one side, and Italy, Spain, France on the other side. It is a very, I say we have entered a situation where what is dominant is chaos. I call it, it's a capitalism of chaos. Capitalism will continue, but will continue in a situation where there is no new order, there is disorder. And where capitalists will try to make as much money as they can in short interventions, putting their investments here, in many cases speculative, in many cases trying to buy some companies that are in bankruptcy, but the possibility of a new emerging economy now it's more difficult than before, and so it's a new moment where it's not the traditional neoliberalist policies. We will have more intervention of the state, but we will have to deal with this permanent crisis and how to build, how to learn from our previous mistakes and how to build new social networks, how to build social movements that are not only focused on some immediate aspects, like, of course, you need relief to eat, for health, you need some kind of support from the state because the situation is terrible, but you also need to think beyond that, to think, okay, then what are we going to do now this time with the banks? Are we going to put all this huge amount of trillions of dollars to save again the banks, or are we going to begin to put those resources to save the people? Are we going to continue with this increasing debt? Debt is increasing, no? In my country, probably debt has increased more than 15% in the last couple of weeks. Now, and this is happening everywhere. Now, are we going to have a situation where we leave aside debt, there is debt relief? Because all of the countries are going to come in a very bad shape after all this process of getting more debt. So the issue of the debt is going to be again one of the keys. Issues that have to do also with intellectual property and the health system is another issue. So I think that in this very chaotic situation of permanent crisis, to rebuild a movement that has in mind not only concrete demands for the day or for the coming weeks, but to really change the economic structures in the countries, to take into account how to really flatten that other curve in order that we don't go beyond the limits of the Earth system And one point that you mentioned is we need to also have a very strong program in terms of defending democracy, human rights, and promoting them and going even further in the democratization of states, because what we will see more and more is authoritarian regimes, authoritarian measures, and the fight for democracy, the fight for human rights for all, is going to be one centerpiece in the building of these alternatives to the failure, total failure of globalization, and especially to this systemic crisis and this capitalism of chaos. You know? And finally, I think we also have to think what other kind of world integration can we develop. So current multilateralism has also failed. No? If you see, have you heard something that the UN has said in the past 2-3 months? I really haven't heard about the UN. I heard about the WHO, the World Health Organization, but the UN, the General Assembly, the Security Council, multilateralism is in a very deep crisis. And we need a multilateralism. I think to criticize globalization doesn't mean that we don't want a world integration. We need a world integration. We need solutions that take into account the entire planet. But they have to be discussed in bodies where there is more fair representation from the different countries. It cannot be like it has been until now, that in the UN you have the 5 members of the Security Council that have veto power and do whatever they want, and the rest that can approve resolutions but not go further than that. So if we have to change multilateralism. And I know that we are going to more local solutions. We are going to more solutions that are based on concrete territories. But on the other hand, if we want to have a world government that is able to save the people and nature, countries have to give up a part of their sovereignty to those multilateral bodies, so that they are able to control when a government does something like destroying the ecosystem of the Amazon or destroying ecosystems in Asia that are going to have great impacts in the entire planet. So we have to also rethink on the role and of national states and of new multilateral bodies in order to confront this systemic crisis.
Okay. Well, definitely, I agree with you that it's several things that I agree with you. Definitely, we have to flatten that curve of, the way that the capitalist economic system, with its push for growth, has really eaten up, gone beyond the limits of ecological stability. Definitely, that curve has to be flattened. And one of the things that came out in the 2008-2009 crisis was that, if you remember, in 2009, the rate of emissions went down, okay? and that was, people said then that this was one of the silver lining of that crisis. But of course, after 2 or 3 years, they went up again, okay? Now, I think that one of the things that is going to certainly emerge because of the way that industrial economies and and air connectivity, all of this have gone down, is that this creates some relief for the climate. Okay, that unfortunately, of course, this comes at the cost of a very strong human crisis, but nevertheless, um, that's there. But we have to go beyond that. You're definitely right that that we have to take advantage of this opportunity to really push, for real agreements, among societies and among governments that, you know, that, um, you know, that that we really need to to really radically reduce emissions, and not only that, reduce other destabilization, ecological destabilization all around that's taking place, including the destruction of natural habitats of wildlife. That in a way that we can say that this is the revenge of wildlife, and so so there's definitely that flattening of the curve, which is going to be really difficult, is really quite important. So I fully agree with you. The second thing that we need to realize here too is that this is going to create a really big political crisis. Okay, right now, people are, because of fear, are complying with all these different measures of social isolation, self-quarantine. But if governments cannot provide, and the United States is having such, even if the United States is having such a difficult time, okay, for people to stay alive economically during the crisis, people are not going to take that. I think, the people are going to come out into the streets, whether or not they're self-isolation or self-quarantine. They are going to come out if the choice is that they face is starvation. And so I think that we are just, the technocrats are thinking about, we just do this. We'll send them a check, and that sort of thing. Or there will be social transfers that will take place in, say, the Philippines or Bolivia, whereby people can have access to relief goods. No, I think I think this is sort of, they're dreaming. I mean, I think that the kind of political explosions that are going to come out of this, they haven't even imagined that kind of thing. And the worry that I have is, are we prepared to be able to provide the leadership, for people when they're basically saying, we're not going to take this anymore, okay? So you have authoritarian governments, even democratic governments have become more authoritarian, and so the challenge is, how do we come out and be part of that mass anger, okay, in order to create the pressures for a change in the system. And of course, this is, as you said, there's going to be, in many ways, this is an uncontrolled force, but but that's always been the case. Whenever there's a force, it can be either controlled in a good way, or is uncontrolled in a bad way, or uncontrolled in a good way. Okay, it's how one takes advantage and inserts oneself in the struggle in a certain direction, so that it moves in a progressive direction rather than in a direction that's bad. So and it's going to be, I think, in this situation where we're not even talking about the the food crisis that's going to come up soon, because farm systems all over are being disrupted. And sure, the world, the Food and Agricultural Administration says, oh, there are enough supplies, but hey, 3-4 months down the line, it's going to have an impact on agriculture, especially in agriculture that has now been integrated in the same way as in industry, whereby, you have global supply chains and those are falling apart. So, so once the food crisis hits with the coronavirus crisis, the kind of political explosion that you're going to have is just going to be quite enormous. And this is what we really need to be prepared for. So the big question, therefore, that you raise is how do we, in the context of this crisis, and a lot of uncontrolled forces, are able to channel it in a progressive direction so that we have progressive forces come to power in countries, and we avoid the authoritarian temptations, because there are, of course, these right-wing people that are going to take advantage of this crisis to move in a more authoritarian direction against migrants, against minorities. Okay, how do we do that? And then, of course, the what you just said is we have to have a progressive multilateralism. Okay, and how do we have a progressive multilateralism at a time where the United Nations seems to be paralyzed at this point in time? But clearly, we cannot have the same old institutions. The World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, they're paralyzed at this point in time, and they might just as well just go because they're not contributing to anything productive in terms of resolving the current situation. I think one of the things we really need to watch out is, the way that the governments will be making choices on the use of public money. Will they use it for people, for employment, or will they use it to save the institutions of capitalism like the big banks? We know last time in 2008 that the money was used to save the banks. For instance, in the United States, they said they were too big to fail, and they put the money there instead of saving homeowners, just to take the case of the United States. And I think to some extent that happened in so many other countries that were affected by the crisis during that time, where people's interests, and certainly as you pointed out, the governments of Northern Europe sort of really pushed the squeeze on the people of Southern Europe to be able to to save their own banks. They put that squeeze through austerity programs, and and we saw that impact in Italy, in Spain, in other countries, whereby the health systems were ruined by the demands of austerity by the German government, the Dutch government, and the other banks. So basically, I think that fights over the allocation of the government budgets, that's going to be really central. So I think that that this is going to be a chronic crisis, that there will be forces that are very hard to control, and that there are going to be political forces that will emerge to try to take advantage to bring about a situation which is ultra-nationalistic and against the majority of people. This is it's within this context that we have to swim at this point. But I would say that I would say that we really need to grapple with the situation, and out of grappling with it will provide the opportunities for leading the world into a more progressive direction. But I cannot see how that kind of deep crisis is going to be avoided at this point in time. I think we just need to keep our values intact and look for opportunities whereby we can convince people that the direction, whether we call it deglobalization or buen vivir, or food sovereignty, this very rich alternatives that people have been able to work out over the years, that they contain the elements of an alternative. They're all there. People have been working on these different progressive paradigms for years, and as I said, what it needs is, how do we create a base for them? And I think that is the challenge that we while we have this chaos going on, how do we create a base for this progressive, ecologically sane proposals that will also promote democracy and human equality? Okay? It's going to be very difficult, but we have no choice but, in fact, to push in that direction. The only last thing I would say here is, you remember how they said that the dinosaurs got eliminated because of the big meteor that came out of space and landed in the Yucatan Peninsula and created this massive planetary destruction that ended the supremacy of the dinosaurs. I think we're, in many ways, maybe at that moment too, okay, when it comes to the domination of the species. And, in many, we have seen how fragile human society and human beings are in the face of the micro challenges coming from the virus, okay? And if and if you combine that challenge with the social challenge that is emerging from this, in terms of the terrible conflicts which could emerge, from this situation, when you combine that synergy, then it might mean something similar in terms of the domination of the human species. So I think that at least we should learn something from the extinction of the dinosaurs, okay? Because unless we watch out, we probably, we might have brought that upon ourselves, okay? Because as you, Pablo, and others who have really pushed this idea, that you just cannot keep on destroying the planet. Okay? At some point, the planet is going to have its revenge, and I think this is a warning point. This is a tipping point, and unless us as human beings can get together to really be able to say, okay, enough is enough, we really have to create sustainable societies that sustain both the human community but have a benign relationship to the planet, to their environmental surroundings. I think that this is the big challenge at this point in time. If we go back to the old system after this crisis, then I think, we might have a superficial stability for some time, but as Martin says, the crisis is just going to get even worse. So this is crisis creating the opportunity, and I hope that us people, progressive people across the world, are able to finally say, hey, we have to take this very seriously. Let us pose the alternatives. We are entering a period of chronic crisis and even conflict. We have to make sure that out of this, a real new world emerges that is not the old that has brought us to this crisis. So I think that I wish I could say that I could be hopeful about the outcome, but maybe a more realistic position on my part is rather than say that I'd be hopeful, I would just say that, you know, we just have to get our shit together, because if we don't get our shit together, we're all going down.
Well then, thank you very much. It has been a very, very interesting conversation. I fully agree with you. I think we cannot go back to the normality. We just have to think that what we have been doing is a big part of the problem. The dinosaurs got extinct because a meteorite came from outside, but in this case, we have created our own meteorite that is going to end with us. So it is in our hands to stop that meteorite that we are creating. The dinosaurs didn't have that option. We have it. Now, are we going to do it or not? That is the question. And of course, we know the big interests that are involved. Many of the capitalist sectors, banks, just want go back to normality and do business as usual. But if this time we really don't change, don't build a new path, I think, yes, we are on the track of the dinosaurs in the 21st century. So, well, then a very big hug from La Paz, Bolivia. Now we have the sun here. I'm sure they are in Bangkok. The moon is outside. It has been a very great pleasure to be with you.
Okay, thank you very much too. This has been a very, very interesting and very productive discussion. I do hope that many more discussions like this are taking place right now, because I think this is, you know, a real opportunity to be able to create, even if it's virtually at first, but physically later on, the alternative that is really important to transform where we're at this point, so that we have a better world rather than a worse one.
A big hug, and until the next opportunity.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you very much, Pablo. Goodbye.